Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I start, Paolo. So first of all, we apologize for not being there. We tried to manage all this, but eventually it was impossible. So for the next time, but it's a pleasure to participate to your seminar, and thank you very much, Filippo and Elisa, for inviting us. This presentation is based on a paper that we published some years ago. You already read the title, Academic Success in American Analytic Philosophy and the Decline of Wittgenstein. So this paper has perhaps a twofold interest for you. On one hand, you might be interested in the methodological issue. The methodological issue concerns the application of quantitative methods, or as we like to say, of a distant reading approach to the history of philosophy. And this might be interesting per se because the application of quantitative methods to the history of philosophy is in a sense unconventional. On the other hand, we also achieved some results, some substantial results using these methods. And so there is also another possible interest of this paper that is more related to the substantial results. They relate to the history of analytic philosophy. So we would like to tell a story within the history of analytic philosophy. And so we will focus a little bit on both aspects, and then we can discuss separately also, if you want, in the Q&A session, both aspects of this work. Okay. So the main topic is what we call the decline of Wittgenstein in analytic philosophy. Let me briefly say what we mean with the decline of Wittgenstein in analytic philosophy. Well, the starting point is that in the 1950s and the 1960s, there was the golden age of linguistic philosophy at Oxford. Oxford was like the main center for analytic philosophy in the world. They had a new graduate program, and many people were coming to study to Oxford. Of course, nowadays Oxford is still very important, but at that time, the core of analytic philosophy, one might say, was Oxford linguistic philosophy. And linguistic philosophy at that time was something that strictly depended on a Wittgensteinian paradigm. Wittgensteinian paradigm, like, related to the work of the later Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein died in 1951, but then the investigation were published in 1953. And the philosophy of Wittgenstein became very dominant in Oxford at the time in which Oxford was dominant within the general scenario of analytic philosophy. And so many people at the time thought that this impact of Wittgenstein on the philosophy of Oxford would have would create a similar process also in the US and in other English-speaking countries within some years. So this conjecture actually was false because actually after some decades the Wittgensteinian linguistic philosophy lost the centrality it used to have in Britain, and it never reached a comparable reputation in the US. So this is more or less what we mean with the decline of Wittgenstein. Let me add some content to this notion. Now, take, for example, some very important Wittgensteinian ideas or some Wittgensteinian cornerstones, both on the metaphilosophical and at the philosophical level. For example, take the science-philosophy divide. Wittgenstein thought that science and philosophy lay on different levels, and that science is a general and explanatory theory, whereas philosophy is an activity of conceptual clarification. And he thought something like this both in the Tractatus and the Investigations. Or take some substantial philosophical ideas. For example, according to Wittgenstein, the source of necessity is our language or our language game, not like the word or some intrinsic properties in the word. It's not a metaphysical source, but rather it is a linguistic source. And that's why there is only a logical necessity, as Wittgenstein puts it in the Tractatus. Or take, I don't know, a philosophy of mind. According to Wittgenstein, mentalism is false and the private language is impossible. Or take the philosophy of action, the reasons that we employ to rationalize or explain rationally our actions are not the causes of those actions. All these are fundamental Wittgensteinian ideas that at the time of the golden age of Oxford linguistic philosophy, were part of a commonly shared body of philosophical ideas. Everybody agreed with the scientific, the divide between science and philosophy, with a certain picture of necessity, a certain critique of mentalism, and about the idea that reasons are not causes. Nowadays, none of such cornerstones are anymore accepted by an average analytic philosopher in an important department of philosophy in the US. And one might ask why has this happened? And of course, there are some explanations of this fact, the fact of the decline of Wittgenstein in the analytic tradition. It is a multi-faced explanation. First, the core of analytic philosophy moved from Britain to the US, and this is related to the fact that actually the geopolitical scenario, the economic world scenario changed, and the US became more central for culture, but also for philosophy. And in the US, analytic philosophy was either a-Wittgensteinian or anti-Wittgensteinian. It was a-Wittgensteinian because they didn't know well Wittgenstein, most of them, and they sort of assimilated Wittgenstein with Carnap. Carnap was a philosopher that they knew better, and they thought he was a good philosopher, but at the same time, he was a philosopher that made some great and incorrigible mistakes that some of them, for example, Quine or Goodman, criticized. And also, at a certain point in the 1960s and 1970s, American analytic philosophers became anti-Wittgensteinians, and they produced a battery of arguments against the Wittgensteinian tradition. People such as Putnam and Davidson and Kripke and and Jerry Fowler. Most of those cornerstones was criticized by analytic philosophers. So actually, we think that this explanation, that now I have reported the explanation very roughly, but we think that this explanation is quite persuasive. We like this explanation, but at the same time, we think it is incomplete. It is incomplete because, of course, not all the analytic philosophers in the US were either indifferent or hostile to Wittgenstein. It is incomplete because, as you know, this explanation focuses more on the later Wittgenstein, but it is also interesting to see the influence and the legacy of the early Wittgenstein in analytic philosophy. And it's also incomplete because actually analytic philosophy is not all philosophy in the US. probably analytic philosophy is hegemonic in the US in the sense of being dominant in the dominant places, but it doesn't mean that the majority of American philosophers are analytic philosophers. And so also the place occupied by Wittgenstein in the US in philosophy might be different in different places. So yes, for example, if you see this, no, yeah, if you look at this data, this concern the occurrence of the name of a philosopher in the titles that we can find in the Philosopher's Index. The Philosopher's Index here in the time span 1950-2009. Here you see that the Philosopher's Index is representative of not only of analytic philosophy, but also of other traditions. And maybe there's an emphasis on English-speaking papers or works. Actually, here also books are recorded. So you see, Wittgenstein is very frequently quoted in the titles. Only Kant, Hegel, Marx, and Heidegger have more quotation than Wittgenstein, but Wittgenstein has more than people such as Sartre, Husserl, Locke, and others. So it is important for us to emphasize that what we are going to talk about concerns the place of Wittgenstein and the decline of Wittgenstein in analytic philosophy, and only in analytic philosophy. We don't want to discuss the larger picture. Yes. So let me show another data which is relevant to our topic, the more precise topic. Here is a paper from Bonino and Petrovich, 2018, where the corpus that they considered is an analytic philosophy corpus, because it arguably the Philosophical Review, News, Journal of Philosophy, Mind, and Philosophy of Phenomenological Research are analytic journals. And you see, this is a scientometric work. They counted the references in the articles, in 5,000 articles published from 1985 to 2014. And here you can see a representation of the decline of Wittgenstein. Of course, Wittgenstein is, here you have a representation of a decline if you accept the kind of description I made initially about the scenario in the 1950s and the 1960s, right? I don't have quantitative data for that. But if you accept that Wittgenstein was part of the core analytic philosophy at the time of the golden age of analytic philosophy, then here you see the difference between the citation of David Lewis, say, or Wittgenstein in this analytic corpus. So what we wanted to do in this work is to look for a more complete picture, some further explanatory details for the decline of Wittgenstein, and yes, we thought that we could achieve new results by changing methods. So because of course the explanation that I have just told you very briefly is an explanation that was achieved by using traditional methods of the history of philosophy, like reading books, closely reading books and articles, and looking for personal impressions, testimonies, and the kind of things that historians of philosophy normally do. But we wanted to try different methods, both changing the close reading perspective with a distant reading perspective, and also not looking only for explanation belonging to the internal history of philosophy, like looking at philosophical arguments during time, but also we wanted to use the tools of the external history of philosophy. So we had two main methodological models for our work. One is the work of Franco Moretti in the literary studies, right? Moretti, like more than 20 years ago, introduced distant reading in the literary studies. The main motivation for this methodological change is the presence of what Moretti calls the great unread. Moretti notices that in literary studies, normally people studies, analyzes only the canon, the literary canon, but the literary canon is nothing but the 1% of the entire literary production. And Moretti thinks that for certain purposes, it would be nice, it would be interesting to study the 99% of the literary production that otherwise would go unnoticed in what Moretti calls the slaughterhouse of literature, quoting Hegel. If you want to consider the 99%, the great unread, then you cannot employ the same traditional methods. You have to change method. You have to look all these big amount of data from a distant perspective. You have to use different tools, or maybe you have to consider different kinds of data. For example, you cannot read 7,000 British novels published in 18th century. Well, but you can look at 7,000 titles. You can look at the metadata. Of course, you lose something, but you gain something else. You gain a picture from the distant perspective. So this was our first model. And the second one was external history of philosophy, for example, the sociology of philosophy, like in the work of Martin Kusch on psychologism, or perhaps the sociology of culture, like in Pierre Bourdieu's studies, or also the sociology of scientific knowledge, like in Merton. All these kind of external explanations, that is, explanations in our case of philosophical facts, the decline of Wittgenstein, based on external social or institutional factors. So we put together these two methodological models, right? And so we considered the following data set. This dataset was provided by ProQuest, and it contains the metadata of the PhD dissertations in philosophy discussed from the end of 19th century to 2015. In particular, in the time span 1981-2010, we have 20,000 lines in these Excel files, right? 20,000 PhD dissertations in philosophy, and we have the metadata of that. Metadata, that is the name of the author, sometimes the name of the supervisor of the PhD dissertation, the title of the thesis, the year of publication, the university in which the thesis was discussed, and also the abstract. In this period, we also have the abstract, and other bibliographic information provided by librarians in the US, right? So we consider this. Let me justify a little bit our choice of working on this data set. The literary genre, PhD dissertations. Why? Well, because analytic philosophy is academic philosophy. Other kinds of philosophy are less academic than analytic philosophy, but normally analytic philosophers work within the university. So then the geographical area, the United States, here we have both real historical philosophical reasons, the centrality of the US for the story we wanted to reconstruct, but also we have practical reasons. If you want, we can discuss it later. It's much more difficult to find the same kind of data for the UK. The time span 1981-2010 is what we call, following Brian Wederson, late analytic philosophy. Late analytic philosophy, we think it's a period with specific features, interesting features that can be studied per se, and that we also think that the decline of Wittgenstein is much more evident there. So now I go little bit faster. Yes, here you have a first look at the data in the corpus. Wittgenstein in the titles in the entire corpus is the second most frequently quoted author, and the same happens in the titles, in the abstracts in the late analytic philosophy period. This can appear as a data that is in contrast with the idea of the decline, but we will come back later and we will show you how we use these tables in our explanation. So the basic idea behind our project, the main assumption is that it is relevant for the analysis of the decline of Wittgenstein to study the academic career, if any, of those PhD students who wrote their dissertation on Wittgenstein, comparing this with the academic career of the PhD students who wrote their dissertation on different topics, on different authors, and in particular on analytic philosophy, right? In order to operationalize this idea of analytic philosophy, we considered 4 names of important analytic philosophers. So Saul Kripke, Jerry Fodor, David Lewis, and Michael Dummett. We think that everybody would agree that they are very important analytic philosophers. If you want, in the second half of the 20th century. If you want, we can discuss our choice later, more in details. We have in the entire corpus, we have selected 2 sub-data sets. One for the Wittgensteinian dissertations and the other one for the analytic dissertations. The Wittgensteinian dissertations are those, like more or less 400, in which the name Wittgenstein occurs in the abstract of the dissertation. And the analytic dissertations are those in which one of these 4 names, Kripke, Dummett, Lewis, or Fodor, occur in the abstract, right? So we have 2 data sets, Wittgensteinian dissertations and analytic ones. Then for each dissertation, so for each PhD candidate, we, using search engines, we reconstructed the career, right? And in particular, we wanted to attribute a numerical value to the highest position each candidate took at the university if they had a career, right? So the numerical value is based both on the academic rank, that is, if they were irregular or adjunct professor or assistant professor, associate, or full professor, and also it is based on the ranking of the philosophy department in which they went to work. We divided very roughly the departments in 3 categories, A, B, and C, where A are very important departments such as Harvard and Princeton and Michigan and Columbia and so on. And C is the community colleges, whereas B is all the other cases, right? Here you see, for example, if you are full professor in Harvard, then you have 65 points. If you are irregular in, I don't know, in Amsterdam, you have 30 points, and so on. You see how it works. Yes, we have called academic success index the number that we associated to each PhD candidate. Of course, this number has no value, no meaning as an absolute value, right? But we think it is useful for making comparisons, and this is what we want to do. So now I show you the result of our measurement of the academic success index for Wittgensteinian PhD students and their dissertations, and for the analytic ones. This is our main result. You see, well, it is much better to study analytic philosophy for having an academic success in the US in philosophy than studying Wittgenstein. Then this is our main result, and is a way of measure, a way to represent the decline of Wittgenstein. This is not only a statistical artifact, but we think it is a solid result. Let me show this point, and then I leave the floor to Guido. We consider the same result normalized by academic age, and nothing changed. We considered other groups of dissertations, for example, dissertation on Gadamer, on Spinoza, on a random sample, and you see here in the figure, the worst thing that you can do if you want to have an academic career in philosophy in the US is to study Wittgenstein. The best thing is to study analytic philosophy in the sense of having Kripke or Lewis or Dummett or Fodor in the abstract of your dissertation. Here is the same result considered in a period disaggregated by periods of 5 years, and nothing changes. The result is solid. The conclusion is still there. And of course, some of the theses were really they were devoted to the philosophy of Wittgenstein. If you read the abstract, you can easily realize if the thesis is on Wittgenstein or whether Wittgenstein is only mentioned in the abstract. We call the narrow Wittgenstein the case in which the thesis is really on Wittgenstein. And you say that the narrow Wittgenstein has a worse, as a lower academic success index than the broad Wittgenstein. And if it happens that both Wittgenstein and one among Kripke or Lewis or Dummett were mentioned in the abstract, well, then this has a positive effects on the academic success index. So everything goes in that direction. And here you have also the result divided by university rankings. This is very important for the rest of our explanation. So what we have done until now, we found a correlation between the choice of the topic, Wittgenstein, and the academic success. I leave the floor to Guido for the rest of the explanation.
Okay, so far we have tried to show that there is a significant correlation between the topic of the PhD dissertations and the academic success, and that this correlation is rather solid. More specifically, we have shown that there is a correlation between the choice of Wittgenstein as a topic for the dissertation and a relatively low academic success. Now, I would like to show that the choice of the topic is not only correlated with academic success, but that it is a real cause of academic success. Obviously enough, this does not exclude the existence of other causes. We are not trying to prove that the topic of the dissertation is the cause of the academic success, but that it is a genuine cause of that success. Thus, we had to check for other possible causes. If these other possible causes turn out to be overriding, so to speak, with respect to the choice of the topic, then, well, this would be a problem for our claim. So let us consider some other possible causes. It is obvious, for instance, that attending a PhD, this is for, okay. Attending a PhD program in a high-ranked university makes for a better academic career. And by the way, this phenomenon can be observed in our data. The two causal factors, I mean, the topic of the dissertation and ranking of the university intersect with one another, and the effect may interact also. But what is relevant for our claim is that the distribution of Wittgenstein's philosophy, Wittgenstein's dissertations, I mean dissertations about Wittgenstein among the ranks of the university, is very close to the distribution of philosophy dissertations in general, as you can see in this table. Therefore, whatever the exact influence of the university ranking, it seems that it cannot obliterate, so to speak, the influence of the dissertation topic. The consistency of our result through the different ranks points to a genuine causal contribution of the topic. And it is also reasonable, I would say it is obvious, that the academic success is influenced by the socioeconomic conditions, and this is probably the strongest single causal factor. But since there are no a priori reasons to think that the socioeconomic conditions per se influence in a systematic way the choice of the topic of the dissertation, and since if there is any influence of this kind, it is certainly mediated by the university ranking? Well, the reasons showing that the ranking does not obliterate the causal role of the topic are valid also for the socioeconomic condition. The same reasoning can be applied. Another objection comes in the form of a conjecture. The conjecture is that smarter students choose certain topics rather than other topics, and that Wittgenstein is a relatively rare choice among smarter students. In such a case, being smart would completely override the choice of the topic as the real cause of the academic success. Being smarter would be the real cause, whereas choosing Wittgenstein is just a byproduct of being smarter in this case. But this objection does not seem convincing to us. First of all, one can see in the same table, we have already seen that even students of A-ranked universities are penalized by Wittgenstein, and students of A-ranked universities are presumably smart enough. But what is more important is that there is no a priori reasons to suppose that Wittgenstein is a relatively rare choice among smarter students. And that say, I don't know, David Lewis is a common choice. The conjecture seems to be arbitrary, and the burden of the proof is on those who make this conjecture. How can you validate this conjecture independently by means of IQ tests or what? It's not easy. In the absence of any independent evidence, the only possible justification for this conjecture is a circular justification. That is, the claim that people working on, say, David Lewis are smarter than those working on, say, Wittgenstein, can only be inferred from the relatively higher academic success. But that is obviously a circular argument. Another objection is based, so this is the third objection, on an alternative historical, can change. On an alternative historical philosophical hypothesis, the hypothesis the decline of Wittgenstein is simply part of the more general decline of central figures of the history of analytic philosophy. The idea is that, well, analytic philosophy is not usually very interested in its own history, so that, well, people forget their fathers, so to speak, after some time. Thus, we checked for the academic success of people who wrote dissertations on Frege, Russell, other examples of fathers of the analytic philosophy. Well, they exhibit a higher academic success than those writing the dissertation on Wittgenstein, so that also this objection can presumably be rejected. And then we have to consider a last possible objection, which takes its cue from the fact that notwithstanding his association with a low academic success, as we have already seen, Wittgenstein has always been a very popular topic for dissertations, 329 dissertations in the 1981 to 2010 period, which is a very high number. According to this objection, the academic success would be low exactly because of Wittgenstein's popularity. The damaging factor would be the popularity of the topic itself, rather the popularity itself of the topic, rather than the philosophical content. The idea is, well, the department simply did not need so many Wittgenstein scholars. They looked for more varied teaching competencies. Several answers could be formulated in response to this objection, but the most significant is probably a country example. Heidegger is the only author who is more popular than Wittgenstein as a topic for dissertations. Yet, even the academic success index associated with Heidegger is higher than that associated with Wittgenstein, and this seems to confirm our hypothesis. Now, let us suppose that we have shown, we have demonstrated in some way that the topic of the dissertation is a genuine cause, among other causes, of course, of the difference in academic success. But why did that happen and how? Now, by using Voice Viewers, which is an open software, we counted the occurrences of different words in the abstracts of the dissertations. So we got two maps. You can see one map and the second map. These two maps are one for the Wittgenstein corpus, that is the abstract for the thesis on Wittgenstein, and the other for the analytic corpus, that is the dissertations on Fodor, Kripke, Lewis, etc. By looking at the two maps, one can discern different patterns. Patterns is a technical, different semantic patterns. Pattern is a semi-technical term in Moretti's works. These are patterns exactly in the sense in which Moretti speaks of patterns. Looking at the most essential and biggest circles in the analytic map, and looking at the words associated with these circles, one can recognize this pattern that suggests the idea that philosophy is a kind of theory. You see, theory is the most common word in these abstracts.
Sorry, the bigger is the circle. It means that there are more.
The bigger the circle, the more numerous the occurrences of the word. The idea that philosophy is some sort of theory which provide arguments and gives accounts and defends claims in order to solve problems. These are all words that occur very frequently in these abstracts. This pattern points to a certain metaphilosophical conception and to a certain philosophical style. Very briefly, one could speak of a science-oriented style and a science-oriented metaphilosophical view. Here you can also see two paradigmatic examples of abstracts from the two corpora. This is from the analytic corpus, and this is from the Wittgenstein corpus. Now, on the basis of the recognition of the different patterns, it chose terms significantly associated with the analytical style and metaphilosophy. And we counted the occurrences in the two corpora. In the analytic corpus, the relative frequency of these terms is more than double than in the Wittgensteinian corpus. Here, these values are absolute values, but the percentage is more than double. Now, perhaps we can skip some considerations on patterns that can be recognized in the Wittgensteinian map. The provisional conclusion is that academic success seems to be quite strictly connected with the choice of a more or less science-oriented philosophical style and metaphilosophy. Now, this result is probably not very new. In a way, it is a confirmation with the aid of quantitative methods and with the addition of some details. It's just a confirmation of the received view according to which there has been a decline in the importance of Wittgenstein in analytic philosophy, while the situation is probably different in other philosophical, in non-analytic philosophical contexts. Yet, we think that we can add something new to the picture. And we can identify the place, so to speak, place in a metaphorical sense, in which Wittgenstein's decline began. Our data seem to suggest that the decline of Wittgenstein is not due to a change in the general cultural zeitgeist, so to speak. If that were the explanation, if the change began in the general cultural zeitgeist, that is from the bottom, so to speak, if that were the explanation, people would probably stop speaking of Wittgenstein's work or speaking so much of Wittgenstein's work. And for instance, students would write few or fewer dissertations on Wittgenstein. But if you look at this table, you can see that this is simply not true. You have to consider these values, 2, 79%, 1, 93%, 1, 0.2% are all always very, very high. Wittgenstein remained throughout the whole period under consideration the second most popular philosophers in dissertations after Heidegger. On the other hand, you can also observe a certain decrease in popularity over time, but we will come back to that in a moment. Our hypothesis is that the decline of Wittgenstein is the consequence of a top-down process, a top-driven process, a process guided by a relatively small number of people who held the power to influence the recruitment in philosophy departments. We try to find some support by considering also the 30 years from 1951 to 1980, prior to the period already considered. We calculated the academic success index for 4 groups of people. People writing their dissertations on Wittgenstein, people writing their dissertations on Spinoza, people writing their dissertations on Carnap and Quine, where Carnap and Quine... Sorry? Yeah, I'm going to say that. Carnap and Quine take the place of Lewis, Fodor, Dummett, and Kripke, and a random sample. The data available for this period are poorer than those available for the period 1981-2010. For instance, we had to rely on the titles of the dissertations rather than the abstracts. And for this reason, the results should be interpreted with some caution. Anyway, these are the results. What can be said quite cautiously is that in this period, choice of Wittgenstein as the topic for your PhD dissertation does not involve any handicap. This helps locate in time the beginning of the decline. But some other data, these data, are more important to check our hypothesis. This is a table of the academic success index for people writing a dissertation on Wittgenstein in column 1, or well, column 2, the middle column, and of the percentage of people writing the dissertation on Wittgenstein with respect to philosophy dissertations in general, the third column. Which is also a rough index of Wittgenstein's popularity, so to speak. All these data are disaggregated by decades, as you can see. What is relevant here is that a decrease, this is the central point, the decrease in the second column occurs before the decrease in the third column. When the academic success index has already dropped, for instance, in the 70s, the popularity of Wittgenstein is still increasing. All these perfectly agrees with our hypothesis, the powerful story we are trying to tell, so to speak. The powerful academic recruiters changed the policy starting from the 70s. The relative decrease of Wittgenstein's popularity followed with a significant delay. Presumably when PhD candidates could realize that Wittgenstein was a bad choice for their careers. And now to Paolo for the conclusion.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, our paper, this was the conclusion of our paper. And we said something like, Wittgensteinian conclusion, like, don't ask for further explanations. The explanations must come to an end, right? Something like, because people wanted to know, well, and why those at the high floor of the policy recruitment of the ones that had in their hands the recruitment policies in the philosophy departments, why did they decide to do that? And we said, well, don't ask, but we didn't mean that it was not a legitimate question, right? We wanted to say only that we didn't do that work further. This was an additional work. So now we want to add something just to suggest a possible direction where one could look at for having additional explanation. So look at these two pictures. These are the picture on the left. You have the Department of Philosophy in Princeton in 1979, whereas on the right you have the same Department of Philosophy Princeton in 1989, 10 years later. So we could do a lot of history of analytic philosophy looking at these two pictures. For example, a Gestalt experiment is, do you recognize first Kripke or Rorty? And this tells us something about you. I don't know. Maybe the pictures are not very easy to see on the PowerPoint. But anyway, Rorty is there. He stands up on the right. You know, and is there only in 1979. He's not there in the other picture because then, as you know, he abandoned the department and he went away from analytic philosophy and he went to work together with literary scholars and comparatists in Virginia. But you know, it's something I would like to focus to ask you to focus your attention on another point. At the center of both pictures, there is a figure. A very important figure is there in the center, David Lewis, right? This is the figure of Lewis. If you look at in our data set at the dissertations in which Lewis is supervisor of the PhD thesis, and then if you calculate the academic success index, well, you have you know, the highest academic success index that you can have, even more than the analytic philosophy dissertation. So this is, I mean, just a suggestion. Maybe if you go to the archives in Princeton and you do this kind of institutional, this empirical work on
this is, of course, a completely different kind of work from the work we've done. It is not some sort of distant reading of data, but you have to go to the archives and do a completely different kind of work.
Maybe you can discover that among those people in that metaphorical place there was David Lewis. And of course, we have also other testimonies about the academic power of Lewis in this period. Guido said this is a very different work. It's true, but it's very nice, according to us, to combine distant reading with you know, using Zoom and going to some details. And also in the work of Franco Moretti, you can find many of such moves. Of course, from the point of view of the external history of philosophy, it is interesting to see that maybe the decline of Wittgenstein depended also on David Lewis, but not above all, in the sense that people like Lewis and Kripke and Putnam and others had good arguments against Wittgenstein, but also in the very practical sense that Lewis was among those who had in their hands the recruitment, and the recruitment was the means was one of the causes of the decline of Wittgenstein, as we have showed. So
I think we're finished.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.